Regarding the Church's position today on just war theory, as noted in previous discussions, it's developed, just as just war theory has developed. Many or some will argue that there is no just war. This is a problem, and I think this has been addressed even if we want to go back to recent documents beginning with Vatican II. Because if we go back to Vatican II, if we look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and if we look at statements by recent popes, we see a principle that is upheld and that I believe must be upheld because it is based on one of those proper common principles of natural law. Man is a social being. If you have a society, there will be someone who must protect and guard that society, just as in a family, the father or the mother, or the father and the mother together are protective of that family, that initial society. So in society, you are going to have someone who is in charge, whether it's an individual, whether it's a group, but they have an obligation to protect that society. That's a principle of that is based on natural law, but it's also a principle that is developed throughout Catholic teaching. And that, as I say in Gaudium et Spes and in the Catechism, it will speak of a legitimate authority has an obligation, not only a right, an obligation to protect its citizens. If an authority has an obligation to protect its citizens, then it must be able to defend itself against an aggressor who is attacking innocent people. It's a simple argument. If we were to take that right away and say, you are the protector of this society, but you may not defend your citizens, well, we render the authority helpless. And we are basically setting them up for destruction, because anyone can then attack a Catholic country because they know that a Catholic country cannot defend itself because they cannot go to war. That's ridiculous. We're not saying that war is good, but we are saying that life is also good, society is good, and that the authority has that obligation to protect its society. That's a critical point of just war theory, as I say, that is still defended today. With Gaudium et Spes, Dignitas Humanae, they also spoke in those documents. In Gaudium et Spes, we have the whole question of the new approach to war. Why? Because Gaudium et Spes is in the 1960s. After World War II, we have nuclear war. And so it's much more careful in speaking of what is going to be a justified war. But it also speaks of conscience, just as Dignitas Humanae does. And what's important here is that as they're speaking of war and trying to limit war in a good sense, they're also speaking of conscience. Why? Because in the 20th century, and as well in the 21st century, we have the question of people who are being attacked because of their religion. This has happened again throughout history. But I have a right in my conscience to follow my conscience as to my religion, and therefore a country also has an obligation to protect its people and to protect that right to worship. So that's another contemporary debate that occurs, but is also defended within Catholic teaching. If you go to the Catechism, you see that it lists many of the principles that were listed in the past as to a just cause, as to proper authority. And it basically just develops these without going into the whole question of the division of ad bellum, in bello, post bellum, but still speaking of that there must be a possibility of victory. We don't go to war just to have all of our soldiers, all of our young men or young men and women killed. There must be a possibility of arriving at peace, at a just society. There also must be proportion. So again, all of those principles that have been spoken about before are included in the Catechism, in all of the teachings since Vatican II. We see this just Pope Leo the 14th spoke about justice in one of his early discussions on justice. He was speaking to leaders, to judges, to lawyers. He wasn't speaking on just war. But he made a statement that's a foundation for just war. Why? Because he said a state cannot live without justice. He was repeating what St. Augustine had said centuries ago. A state requires justice. Justice within that society is protected by its leaders, by its judges, by its courts of law. But if there is not justice within that state, or if that state does not practice justice towards others, it will lead to war. Therefore, this is rather a foundational principle for a society within itself to live justly, to not take advantage of its own citizens. Why? Because what is war? How does war develop? It develops out of our own individual problems many times. If I cannot forgive the other as an individual, how will I ever forgive another nation? Now, these are not as much basic delineated principles of just war, but they're underlying everything that the church teaches. Why? Because the church's teaching on just war actually is about peace and about forgiveness.